It's September 10th, 1924, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Teenagers Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were in many ways the archetypal modern murderers. They'd pled guilty to brutally killing 14-year-old Bobby Franks in cold blood, hitting him over the head and asphyxiating him. They'd refused to show remorse or apologise, and when asked why they'd killed Franks, replied, "Because we damn well wanted to." And yet, today in history in 1924, these young men, who were also gay lovers, were spared the death penalty by Chicago judge John Caverly, who controversially instead sentenced them to life in prison plus 99 years.
Yeah, the whole of the city was listening as this judgment came down. It was 9:30 in the morning, and throughout the entire city, groups of Chicagoans had clustered around their radio sets to listen. And the star defense attorney Clarence Darrow had to really try hard to be not too triumphalist, and he pushed back this lock of his hair that had fallen over his forehead and commented, "Well, it's just what we asked for, but it's still pretty tough."
Yeah, not so concerned with not appearing triumphalist were Leopold and Loeb themselves, who were taken back for their final night in the county jail before they'd be transferred to the penitentiary, where they apparently asked for steaks and chocolate eclairs to celebrate.
Oof.
Yeah, I mean, and actually they had behaved this way through the entire proceedings. You know, this is often called the trial of the century, but it wasn't actually a trial because they had pled guilty. It was just a prolonged sentencing hearing. But there had been reports in the paper of them laughing or looking bored during the testimony. You know, they had shown no remorse. They were probably the least sympathetic killers you can possibly imagine. You know, they were these rich deviants in the minds of many at the time, and they were guilty of a callous and premeditated murder of a child. They seemed made for the death penalty. And yet, a lot of the contemporary coverage suggests that public opinion was surprisingly sympathetic. One report claims many of the letters and messages received by Caverly during this, prolonged sentencing deliberations were encouraging mercy, and those who objected to them being spared the death penalty often did so on the grounds of classism rather than bloodlust. The Hartford Courant wrote, "The fact is, if those boys had been poor, without money to hire alienists, as analysts were called at the time, and lawyers, a jury would have strung them up and the world would have been thankful." And it's pretty hard to argue with that sentiment.
Class comes through every single part of this, right from the moment, in fact, that detectives arrived to question Loeb. They didn't park outside his house. They parked in front of some apartment buildings down the block to avoid embarrassment to his family when they took him for questioning, even though they knew he did it. They just couldn't believe in themselves that he had anything to do with it. And kind of Chicagoan society wouldn't accept it either, because Loeb's father was the vice president of Sears Roebuck. They were wealthy, they were well educated. They lived in Kenwood, a rich neighborhood of Chicago, in big mansions. There was just no sense that these were the kinds of people that would go around randomly picking out someone at 14 years old in broad daylight as he walked home from a baseball game, luring him into their car and murdering him.
Yeah, so the two entitled teenagers/murderers we're talking about are Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. Loeb was the son of this high-flying American executive. He was actually very, very charming, but a bit more of a dropout than Leopold. He switched university a few times and was a bit of a lackluster student who spent more time playing cards and drinking and reading dime novels, which becomes significant, than he did sitting in classrooms.
I mean,
Meanwhile,
not to be a Clarence Darrow, but in Loeb's defence, he was also the University of Michigan's youngest ever graduate. He got his undergraduate degree at 17. So I think he probably felt like he had really maxed out his educational potential by this time.
This is true. His neighbour, meanwhile, was Nathan Leopold, and he was a law student and a believer in Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Superman. You know, the idea that it's possible to rise above good and evil and sort of do exactly what you want if you're a certain class of person. And he had earned the distinction of being an amateur ornithologist. He'd already published 2 papers in the Orc, which was the leading ornithological journal in the US.
They were both extremely intelligent. There's often a lot of discussion over who was the ringleader. Leopold is often characterised as the ringleader just because he was so academic and abstract in his thinking that he is seen as the mastermind. Leopold himself later said that he was basically obsessed with Loeb, who was, kind of handsome, sporty, and sociable in comparison, and that he said he, quote, literally lived or died on his approval or disapproval. But I think it's maybe a bit of a red herring to wonder who was the supposed ringleader. The real issue was that one of them was obsessed with the idea of being a Superman who could do whatever he wanted, and the other one was obsessed with committing the perfect crime. So when he brought them together, if they had become friends with other people, they may have gone in very different directions with these interests.
So on the day of the crime, they spot Bobby Franks on the street. Now, they did know him because Loeb was his second cousin. They happened to have seen each other recently for a tennis match on a family property. So he was able to lure him into his vehicle by saying, we'll give you a lift home. I want to talk to you about the tennis match. Franks had said he didn't want a lift, but he got in the car, at which point, almost instantly, at 5 p.m, Loeb hit him over the head and then asphyxiated him by shoving a rag down his throat when the original chisel to the skull didn't do the trick. They then drove down to a swamp near the Indiana border where Leopold had often been birdwatching. I mean, this is kind of the casuality that underpins this whole enterprise. And they stopped on the way for a snack. They went and got hot dogs and root beer, which they then ate in the car with Bobby's body under a blanket in the back seat as they did. And they decided to stuff Franks's corpse into a drainage culvert that Leopold knew about, because they thought that if they did that, it would decompose beyond recognition long before it was ever found. They poured acid on it as well. But they hadn't accounted for the fact that en route, Leopold would drop his glasses, which had a distinctive hinge. So the police found the spectacles and they found the body.
So after stowing Bobby's body in the drainpipe, they sped off, and by now the Franks family were already frantically hunting for their son. He was on his way home, so his absence had been noted. Leopold and Loeb then began a cruel game of pretending to have kidnapped him. They sent notes, they made cryptic phone calls. It only lasted until the next day when Bobby's body was discovered by workmen. But the ransom note was a planned red herring from the start. They always intended to murder Bobby. The note was seen as a way to confuse and delay the investigation, as well as drumming up the media interest that they so desperately craved.
Yeah, exactly. It seems very far from the idea of a perfect crime when you start to look into its details, particularly the bit that they'd planned where they were going to get the ransom money by telling Bobby Frank's father to throw it out of a moving train that was passing over a bridge. They'd have their car waiting beneath and then pick up the money and speed off with it. But all of this hinged on the idea that the body wouldn't be discovered quite quickly, and also that they wouldn't make a rudimentary mistake like dropping their glasses.
Which is why I guess they confessed immediately. And immediately the question was, okay, but why? Why did you do this? Because it wasn't for the money, because as we said, Franks' father, Jacob, was actually at the bank withdrawing the money to pay the ransom note when he heard that his son's body was in the morgue. Horrifying kind of idea to imagine. But there was never any chance that they'd get the ransom. So why did you do it? And that was the question that kind of hung over everything, as it does when young men murder other young people and there's no discernible motive. Why? Why? What they did have was money. And so their family turned to Clarence Darrow, one of the best-known lawyers in America, anti-capital punishment chap, who believed in social determinism. Humans turn to crime because society made them that way. It's not because of their own free will. And it was almost like Darrow's greatest challenge in his entire career, really, was to try and find the reason why society had made them this way, when clearly they were actually just awful, genuinely awful people.
Yeah, his most famous part in the case is his celebrated 12-hour address to the court. But actually, his most significant contribution to the outcome probably came much earlier, when he persuaded Leopold and Loeb to plead guilty rather than take the more obvious, spoilt rich boy route of pleading insanity.
And therefore there wouldn't be a trial at all. There wouldn't be a jury trial because they'd confessed.
Yeah, he calculated that throwing themselves on the judge's mercy would make for a better shot than putting the case to a jury. And Darrow actually said as much himself in his famous speech. He said directly to Caverly, "Where responsibility is divided by 12, it is easy to say, away with him. But, Your Honour, if these boys are to hang, you must do it. It must be by your cool, premeditated act without a chance to shift responsibility."
Yeah, what's fascinating about Darrow is that his opposition to capital punishment is, as you say, Ollie, this kind of intellectual thing that he was basing on this new scientific research being done in the early 20th century, especially in the field of what was called dynamic psychiatry, which emphasized those ideas of infinite infantile sexuality and unconscious impulses that denied that human actions were freely chosen. This is all of the stuff that's like the things that happen to you when you're a young person come to impact what you can do and the decisions that you make as an older person.
Yeah, it is hardly fair, he argued, to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university, referring to the fact that he read Nietzsche. Meanwhile, the public at large were not buying this argument. William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper magnate, invited Sigmund Freud to come over from Germany to look into the boy's psyche, but he declined. Although one of the sort of ironic things that was dug out in this process of lingering over every possible scrap of evidence is it emerged that in a school debate, just very shortly before his murder, Bobby Franks himself had argued vehemently against the use of capital punishment for criminals and won. So, weirdly, afterwards, at least that was something that his mother could cling on to, was like, well, I suppose I didn't want them to hang either because that's not what Bobby would have wanted.
Well, if it was any consolation to the hang them lobby, in Loeb's case, it seems like the death penalty wasn't really avoided, it was more delayed. He didn't last that long in prison. In 1936, he was slashed to death by another inmate. Unlike Leopold, who was a model prisoner, apparently quite popular, introduced a lot of educational programs in the prisons where he was held, he was paroled in the 1950s and moved to Puerto Rico, where he worked first in a hospital and then as a researcher at the Department of Health.
When he was then asked whether he'd ever gotten over the idea of himself as Superman, he replied, "I've gotten over being 19.
Yeah, in one of his parole hearings, he had said, "All I want, if I am so lucky as to ever see freedom again, is to try to become a humble little person." So it's kind of the exact flip of what he started out espousing.
And then he looks at the camera and winks.
Yeah.
Now,
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/Retrospectors.
I'm historian Ruth Goodman, host of Noise's newest podcast, The Curious History of Your Home. I've spent my life investigating the hidden history of everyday objects. The vacuum cleaner in your cupboard, sleek and compact today, but when it was invented, it was literally powered by horses and took 4 to 6 people to operate. The minty fresh toothpaste by your sink. Well, if you lived in ancient Greece, you'd be washing your teeth with ground up bones and oyster shells. Double glazed windows? We owe those to a French king's odd fascination with oranges. The Curious History of Your Home explores the extraordinary in the ordinary. Listen to The Curious History of Your Home each Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. From award-winning podcasters Noiser, The Curious History of Your Home.